Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm creating some cleaning themed die cut cards using the new Shiny Day collection from Spellbinders. We have the Squeaky Clean die set. This is the Petal Fresh die, some beautiful florals in that one. So many sentiments in the Shiny Day sentiments stamp set. And then we have the Buds and Suds 3D embossing folder. Two different backgrounds, perfect for this collection. I'm going to create 3 different cards. I'm going to just use the Squeaky Clean die set for the first one. I'm going to combine the 2 sets, or the 2 die sets for the second card, and then for the last one, I'm just going to use the Petal Fresh. I'm using a few metallics with this because I thought it would be a great way to just add a different finish to some of those die cuts. So I'm using the brush finished metallic or Onyx treasured cardstock for the mop handle as well as the rubber gloves. And then I'm using the Aquamarine treasured cardstock in both the mirror as well as the matte finish for the little cleaning bucket there. I have some matte silver cardstock for the handle to the bucket. These pieces are super easy to put together, and for some of the smaller pieces where I know where they're going to fit, I just put some Barely Art glue on there, use the fine line bottle, and then I use the new handy tool set to pick up those tiny die cuts. I love that tool set for the tiny die cuts, and I really love the fact that there's 2 different wax tool or tools with wax tips in different shapes, so you can pick and choose which works best for you. And that set also comes with replacement tips too, which is fantastic. So as I'm putting these together, I like to put my acrylic block on top of those die cuts to let them dry, make sure everything's nice and flat. When I'm using these treasured cardstock pieces, I do let that glue dry just a little bit longer because it has a non-porous coating on the top, so that glue doesn't really seep into that cardstock. So I'll let that dry to the side while I add a sentiment to my cards. Now, I haven't used this set before, so the very first thing I do when I have a clear stamp set that I haven't used is use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue and helps those stamps take ink just a little bit better. And then I use a soft brush to remove any of those eraser bits. Now, there's tons of different sentiments to choose from. You can see that I'm having trouble picking which ones I want for the cards that I have envisioned, but I'm going to pick all 3 at the same time. But I will be doing them as I'm creating those cards because I do want to heat emboss those sentiments and then emboss the backgrounds with that embossing folder. I'm doing the heat embossing. I always love heat emboss sentiments because it just adds that extra little bit of shine, that extra little bit of texture. You could easily just use plain ink for this and stamp it, but just make sure that it's a nice bold ink because I'm going to emboss it. I don't want that sentiment to get lost in that texture. So I thought by heat embossing it, it makes that sentiment just a little bit more bold and it can stand up to that embossing. I am going to let that dry for a few minutes or a few seconds really, just to make sure that that embossing powder is nice and cool. We don't want it liquid when we put it in that embossing folder. We don't want it to stick in there. Then I put it in the bubbles part of the suds part of the embossing folder and run it through my die cutting machine using the stacking for 3D embossing folders. For this card, I'm trimming down the mats to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I'm trimming my embossed pieces to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And those measurements are the same for all 3 cards. I chose to do just plain A2 cards for this, but I think these would be really cute done with shaped card bases. I do shaped card bases often. I just think they just add a unique touch, especially if you're going to hand make a card. It often is something that you wouldn't find in store-bought cards, different shapes or that sort of thing. So I do really like doing it myself. For a touch of visual dimension, I'm using a little bit of Vintage Photo Distress ink on the bottom of the mop. And then I'm using Hickory Smoke Distress ink on the cleaning bottle, on the soap bottle, just to add a little bit of color around the outside edges. I don't do it to any of the pieces that are done with the treasured cardstock though, because it is a non-porous surface, the ink won't stick to it. So there's no point in even trying to put ink on there. We're just not going to see it. So now that I have my embossed piece of my mat on my card, I'm ready to add my little die cuts here. To glue everything together, I'm using Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. It works perfectly for gluing die cuts to cards as well as gluing the layers to the die cuts. And these ones are fairly simple to layer together. There's not a ton of layers on top of each other, but I love the fact that there's so many different choices in that Squeaky Clean die set. Now I'm doing cards with this, but I think this would be a great scrapbook page as well. Fun accessories for that as well. So here's that finished first card. Now we're ready to work on the second one. And like I said, I'm going to combine the Squeaky Clean die set with the Petal Fresh die set. For this one, I'm using the Onyx Treasured Cardstock in mirror as well as brushed for my cleaning bucket. I'm using matte silver cardstock for the handle, and then just regular cardstock for the rest of the pieces. Once I have the two pieces layered together, I could just let them dry. You can see that the pieces only have 2 or 3 pieces to them, or the die cuts only have 2 or 3 pieces to them. So super easy to assemble, and then just let that completely dry. So this one here, I'm not going to do any ink blending to, but you certainly could if you wanted to add that little bit of visual dimension to it. It's really up to you how much or how little you want to go. I tried to keep these cards fairly clean and simple, but I did think it made it a little bit realistic to have that vintage photo on the bottom of the mop for the last card. I chose to keep it or keep the ink blending off for this card. So we've got that bucket together. That one's going to take just a little bit extra time to dry because of that treasured cardstock pack. If you haven't heard of those treasured cardstock packs before, they come in several different colors, and each pack has 15 sheets, 3 sheets each of 5 different finishes. So there's mirror, there's brushed, there's matte, there's glitter, and there's pearl. And they all go together really, really well. And I love using them, especially around Christmas time, or for instance, like this, where we want some die cuts that have just a different finish to them. It just adds something extra to those cards. Now for this card, I'm going to use, or I'm going to make the card horizontal just for something a little bit different from the last one. Our last card with the florals, I'm going to be using the buds, the floral part of the embossing folder, and that one does have to be a horizontal card just because of the orientation of the pattern on the embossing folder. It's got florals to it, but they also have stems, so it is fairly directional. We wouldn't want to have those flowers with the stems to the sides. They would look a little bit odd on a vertical card. So I chose to make this one a horizontal card as well. I don't do horizontal cards very often. I typically just prefer the vertical ones, but horizontal ones, obviously it works when it's a certain or when the die cuts or when something needs it. If there's something a little bit too wide and too narrow, you just have to do a vertical or a horizontal card. For this one, I'm going to ink my embossing folder just to get a little bit more color variation for that background. So I'm using Lost Shadow Distress ink. I didn't want a dark ink because, again, I didn't want to lose my sentiment. I wanted it to be light enough so that the sentiment was going to be shown right through there. I heat embossed my sentiment just like the last time because I really liked the finish of it. I'm going to do this 2 times. You can do this as many or as few times as you want. Obviously, the more you do it, the more ink you're going to get. The cool thing about using distress ink on embossing folders, especially for the first or second pass, is it kind of beads on there. So it really suits this theme. To remove any of those beaded looks, you just keep doing it, or you keep repeating the process to build that ink up and to fill in those areas. Now it's a little bit harder to fill in the areas when you're working with a light color. It's a lot easier with a darker color because it's just going to have some darker coverage to it. The mats or the cutting sizes for my pieces are exactly the same as the last card. My saffron piece here is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My embossed piece is 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Once we have those layers together, we can start adding our pieces to the front of the card. I really like the look of that bubbles background with that lost shadow. I think it just really brings that texture out to that. I think you could use a light blue too. I think that would look great. So once we have our pieces together, often if I have an acrylic block on something while it's drying, I'll lay my pieces on top just to see if the design I have in my head is going to work on that background. It just shows you exactly what it's going to look like. You can adjust or move things as needed while you're doing that. And the great thing with doing liquid glue or using liquid glue is you can move and shimmy things in place as you're creating. If you need to tuck something underneath it, it makes it really, really easy to do that. Now, I'm not using a ton of florals here. I only have one floral and a leaf, but I just thought it was a great combination with the 2 different die sets. I thought it made it look a little bit cute. So here we have our finished card. Super simple again and fairly clean because even though we inked that background, it's a light color ink. Now I wanted to add just a little bit more texture to the center of the flower, so I'm using some stickles just on that center. Now on the center, I used the antique white treasured cardstock in the pearl finish. So it has a little bit of a gold shimmer to it. And when I put the stickles, I only put it towards the center. So we still see that pearl cardstock behind it. It just adds a little bit of extra texture to the center of those florals. So for the last card, I'm using just the Petal Fresh die set. They're really easy to layer these pieces together. So I've got them all layered together. The flowers that I have duplicates of, I just assembled them off screen rather than having a lot of repetition. For these ones, I just put the glue right on the center of the flower, and then I'm lifting up the die cut pieces that go onto that, and then just placing them there with that wax handy tool. For a little bit of extra detail, I'm using a black Posca marker just to add some dots on some of the florals. Because I heat embossed my sentiment in black embossing powder, or I plan to, I wanted that to tie in with my florals or with my design. So by adding some black dots there, that black embossing powder ties in. You could change the color of embossing powder up, but I wanted it to be continuous through the 3 cards. And I thought this was a great way to just have them tie in together. So once again, putting this in my Misti stamping tool to stamp that sentiment with some VersaMark ink, pour that embossing powder on top of that, clean off any granules of powder that might be sticking where you don't want them to stick, and then we can melt that sentiment on there with the heat tool, and then let that dry for a few moments and put it into our embossing folder in order to emboss that pattern there. So once we've put it through our folder, we can trim that down and then assemble our card. Now, I typically like to use a little bit larger cardstock than what I want my final piece to be, because when you're using embossing folders, 3D embossing folders especially, sometimes it skews the measurements on the card. By having that cardstock just a little bit bigger, you can make sure to trim it down to the exact size that you're wanting so that it fits your project properly. Once we have those trimmed down, we can glue them onto our card base, and you can see that I die cut my florals right out of the center of this mat. Once we have all of our layers on our cards and the die cuts in the middle, you're never going to know there was anything die cut out of there, and it just extends your cardstock a little bit, especially for those treasured cardstock pieces. The metallic cardstocks, the specialty cardstocks, is a great way to extend them and to have them go just a little bit farther, just to get a little bit more out of there. Because it's covered, why not die cut something out of there? So I'm going to glue my pieces to the front of my card. I'm creating a really simple floral cluster in the center of this card. If you wanted, there are more florals in this die set. You could add more florals to it. I chose to keep it very, very simple. I wanted that embossed background to be visible as well, and I didn't want to fit in too many clusters for it. When I'm doing something like this, I'll know where my center is, and I'll start working from the back to the front, doing a cluster of leaves, and I'll typically do them in odd numbers. And then if there are sprays with florals, like those little bell flowers on there, I will put those in front of those leaf swag branches, just a little bit to the side of them. Rather than putting them right on top, I'll just put it a little bit to the side so it fills it in more. Then I'll have some smaller florals to go tuck in behind the larger floral in my center, and then the larger floral in the center. And this one, I also did the stickles in the centers of the flowers just to add a little bit of texture, a little bit of sparkle. The one that I use is opalescent, so it has no color to it. It just adds that sparkle as well as that texture, and whatever color cardstock is underneath there shows through, so we're not losing any color with it. Then we have our second card that combines the Squeaky Clean die set with the Petal Fresh die set. Again, a super simple card, but I just love that bubbles background. This bubble background I think would be really cute with the house mouse stamp that came out last month, where you have the house mouse in the bathtub with all the bubbles. I think this would be a really cute background for that. And then we have our very first card. Again, very simple, but I do think those treasured cardstocks, the specialty cardstocks, really add something to it because of the different finish on them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.